This is the podcast for the journal Neuropsychopharmacology. I'm Cynthia Graber. Kirstie, Cummings and Sofia Beas are both new assistant professors in the Department of Neurobiology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. When they met, they discussed the job application process, their support network, and their own personal processes, and they decided to write an article that could serve as a resource for candidates from different backgrounds, many of whom might not have the same resources that Dr. Cummings and Dr. Beas did. The result was their paper, A Scientific Approach to Navigating the Academic Job Market, published in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology. First, I was wondering, what resources are there for navigating the academic job market?
I think there's plenty of resources, but they're not very well known. They're kind of hidden, and then they kind of also all over the place. So it's such an extensive process that it's kind of fragmented of the kind of advice that you get from different places. So we figure that we can just kind of put everything together into one place as a guide for others. And if you look at our table, we cite several articles and we have just a very comprehensive list of other resources across all categories, from interviewing to just writing the statements and etc.
And in addition to that, so a lot of the articles that exist are really, important starting points in terms of knowing what do I need? Here's a step-by-step checklist of components for the application that I might need, and don't really necessarily address how you should be approaching the job search. So that was one aspect that we really wanted to contribute, was to really help the candidates to have a way to be able to develop a method to navigate the search rather than just have a series of checkboxes.
Well, and that actually leads very well into my next question, which is, what does it mean to take a scientific approach to navigating the job market? How is that different from any other approach people might be using?
Yeah, so I think one reason why we wanted to write in this kind of style is because we as scientists have really been trained to use the scientific method to guide our investigations in the lab. And while we can really think of this as a framework that might only apply to research, the reality is that it can really be applied to many different situations, including preparing for and navigating the job interview process. So what we wanted to do was to highlight this to the job candidates, to really allow them to see that this process is no different from pursuing a project in the lab. So let's break it down, think about it, organize our thoughts. How are we going to address this? And ultimately, how are we going to navigate the process? And this is what we've really been trained to do in the lab since day one. And so when we think about it in this way, it makes this process a little bit more digestible, in my opinion.
One important thing to kind of highlight is the fact that applying for jobs is one of the most important scientific endeavors that, as a scientist, we take up to date, especially as a young scientist. So putting this, a lot of time, effort, preparation, as we do to other scientific endeavors, that was also part of the writing, and try to appeal to the candidates to think of this not as something to do on the side, but also to approach it, to put everything else on the side and then just focus solely on this really important part of your career.
So how did you break it down?
We did it as we were doing a scientific project. We broke it down into pieces, and then we delineate the scientific process, and we just decided to give a little bit of advice of how to, do each of the sections. But not only that, I think one important aspect was also just gathering the resources that were put into the table and just dividing it by stages and organizing them so that, they can be more of help for future candidates.
And what are those categories or stages?
Yeah, so typically the job search process could be divided into 4 stages. So the first is, of course, preparing and searching and applying for positions. And then after that, we guide the candidates through the pre-interview process, then through the full interview process, and then finally the post-interview processes, including negotiation, as well as ways to accept as well as decline offers that may have been made.
How did you decide what to include in each stage?
As we were kind of going through the job market ourselves and doing our own research and, identifying resources that were really helpful versus maybe those that were a little less helpful, we really tried to distill down a list of these resources that were really quite helpful to us and try to organize them in such a way that you could see it sort of logically flowing through that job application process.
So you've explained why you call this a scientific approach to the job market, but it almost seems obvious to me. Like, of course, a trained scientist would do this. But do you feel like you know people who maybe got overwhelmed and just weren't able to approach it this way?
I think so. I think at first when I decided to start the process, I myself got overwhelmed. And it wasn't until I broke it down into these pieces that I was able to put a plan to move forward. But I have seen that other people also get overwhelmed by this process, which might have contributed to perhaps not dedicate the time and the effort that it needs for this process. Yeah.
Is there any advice you wish you'd known earlier?
I think personally for myself, I wish maybe that I wouldn't have been so hard on myself because, as Sofia said earlier, this process is extremely time consuming. Like, this is your front and center kind of activity that you're going to be doing for the next, 2 to 4 months. Like, it's very time consuming and it's very easy to drop the ball in many different aspects of your life. And I think what I wish I had known is that it's okay, that this is, stressful again. And then something that I learned later on was to really, instead of being very stressed out, maybe we should start to enjoy the process. We got to meet a lot of different really cool people, develop very exciting ideas for collaboration. And it's very easy to get lost in the stress and the kind of lack of sleep and everything and kind of overlook this really exciting time period in your life.
This is the podcast for the journal Neuropsychopharmacology. To read the article discussed in the podcast, go to www.nature.com/NPP. I'm Cynthia Graber.